Okay, folks, we're going to get started on the analysis portion of part 3. And what I really want to focus on is the cultural diffusion. We ended with him talking about just give you a brief overview of the cycle of Russian civilization. But what we're really going to concentrate on is cultural diffusion. We have said that the cultural of civilization is created in the core area and originally moves outward into its peripheral area, thus becoming part of the civilization. And this movement of cultural elements is called diffusion by students of the subject. In other words, it's just like anything else. Anything else in nature. You put a drop of oil in water, and the core is going to be where the drop first initiated, and then the essence of that drop is going to be diffused throughout the whole glass of water, and it's going to diffuse in whatever rate of the medium that it's in. And the lighter elements, or the most transportable elements, are going to be diffused first. That's just nature. And so it is noteworthy that the material elements of the culture, such as tools, weapons, vehicles, and such, diffuse more readily and thus more rapidly than the non-material elements, such as ideas, art forms, religious outlooks, and stuff, culture, in other words. Culture is more complex. Culture is more identified with the people from which it came. So it's harder to understand, therefore it's harder to diffuse, harder to export. You take something like comedy or humor. Humor is different all over the world because it's a cultural element. So humor in one culture is different than another, and it's harder to understand unless you've been in that culture for a while. So it's a lot more complex and more subtle. So it's harder to export. It's easier to export a cell phone or an iPad than it is a joke, because the joke depends on language, it depends on culture, it depends on some sort of a knowledge or history in a certain culture. Whereas a cell phone, the instructions are pretty clear, it's pretty standard, and a child can learn how to use a cell phone quicker than it can learn an adult joke. That's just the way things work. And it says, for this reason, the peripheral portions of a civilization, and he gives a couple of examples like Assyria and Mesopotamian civilization, or Rome and classical civilization, or the United States or Australian Western civilization, tend to have somewhat cruder and more material culture than the core area of the same civilization. That just makes sense. Though culture is a pattern of doing something, and that's harder to export. So their material culture is not tied. The rules that develop that. For this reason, non-material and spiritual elements of a culture are what give its distinctive character rather than the tools and weapons. Very true. There's a difference between Chinese culture and American culture or European culture. Thus, the distinctive character of Western civilization rests on its Christian heritage and its scientific outlook. The distinctive character of Western civilization rests on its culture and not its exportable commodities. The export of material elements in a culture across its peripheral areas to the peoples of a totally different society, like he says, gives strange results. Why? Because the idea or the essence that created such elements don't export with it. So they use it in a different way than the people that actually invented the thing or actually developed the thing. So when you export it, it's going to be used completely different, because basically the instructions that came with it don't come with the thing. And here's a key. As the elements of material culture move from the core to the periphery inside a civilization, they tend in the long run to strengthen the periphery at the expense of the core, because the core is more hampered in the use of material innovations by the strength of its past vested interests. And because the core devotes a much greater part of its wealth and energy to non-material culture. Thus, such aspects of the Industrial Revolution as automobiles and radios are European rather than American inventions, but have been developed and utilized to a far greater extent in America because this area was not hampered in their use by the surviving elements of feudalism, of church domination, of rigid class distinctions. We're seeing this now because our manufacturing prowess, our scientific and manufacturing technical advances have been exported elsewhere. But the thing is, because they've been developed, here, they're tied to such things as high wages. They're tied to such things as a social class, social welfare. They're tied to such things as high taxes and things like that, because as we've developed these things, these have come online, people want their part of the pie. The people that develop them want their part of the pie. So that had to be negotiated. But when it's exported to someplace else, it's new to them. They're not tied to that kind of thing. It's raw, so they can use it anywhere they want. Any way they want, and what they call the baggage, I wouldn't call it baggage, but the baggage that goes along with it develops at a slower rate. So in other words, since the culture didn't transport with it, and the culture is what slows it down or puts restrictions on the development of such things. You take some things like stem cells or nanotechnology, or even reproducing organs in biology. Okay, we have religious restrictions and moral restrictions against such things, but you take it to China, you take it to Latin America, you take it to Korea, they don't have those restrictions. So it's untethered. It can develop as fast as they want it to develop because there's no restrictors on it. The diffusion of cultural elements beyond the boundaries of one society into the culture of another society presents quite a different case. The boundaries between societies present relatively little hindrance to the diffusion of material elements, and a relatively greater hindrance to the diffusion of non-material elements. See, that's a key. That's a key right there. That's a key we need. That's a key we need to look at, because that's going to bode well, or that's going to come up great when we look at China, when we look at Asia, when we look at other, Latin America. The diffusion of material elements from one society to another has a complex effect on the importing society. In the short run, it usually benefited by the importation, but in the long run, it is frequently disorganized and weakened. And he gives you examples of some people imported a certain technology and were aided by it. Some people got the technology and were hampered by it. It destroyed them. He uses the Indians in America as an example. There's cases where the Plains Indian got horses and they were able to raise their standard of living and even for a time fight off the Americans, the Americans coming west, whereas the Appalachian Indians got different technology and such as whiskey, but they also got European diseases and it destroyed them. And so here's another key. In general, the importation of an element of material culture from one society to another is helpful to the importing society in the long run only if it is A, productive, B, can be made within the society itself, and C, can be fitted into the non-material culture of the importing society without demoralizing it. The destructive impact of Western civilization upon so many other societies rests on its ability to demoralize their ideology and spiritual culture as much as the ability to destroy them in a material sense. Remember, you can only take these elements if it can be fit in, if it can be shoehorned in and fitted into your culture. Whereas it destroyed the Chinese culture, The Japanese were able to fit Western civilization into their own culture, and they developed much more rapidly. They were a martial culture, so they were able to take Western civilization and fit it into their own ideology. When one society is destroyed by the impact of another society, the people are left in a debris of cultural elements derived from their own shattered culture as well as from the invading culture. These elements generally provide the instruments for fulfilling the material needs of the people, but cannot be organized into a functioning society because of lack of ideology and spiritual cohesive. A lot of this happened to the African people. The Western civilization shattered our culture, shattered our civilization, and now we're in the midst of piecing back together a cohesive. Such people either perish or incorporated as individuals and small groups into some other culture whose ideology they can adopt for themselves and above all for their children. We took on Western ideology, Christianity. We took on their technology, guns, alcohol, how we make clothing, all that kind of stuff. And it shattered, it couldn't be incorporated into African ideology. And so it has to be reintegrated. We had to find another ideology, form another ideology, and to be able to integrate the Western civilization into our societies. So we have to find another way to do this. Such a new ideology may be imported may be indigenous, but in either case it becomes sufficiently integrated with the necessary elements of material culture to form a functioning whole, thus a new society. It is by such process as this that all new societies and thus all new civilization have been born. We can create a new society. We can create a new civilization. But this is the process that we have to engage in. Here he's just talking about how technology was transported over, but the ideology wasn't. And since the ideology wasn't transported over, the effectiveness of the technology could never be fully implemented. It had to be copied. Here's a key. Here's a note. Societies such as Russia have been able, because of the lack of scientific tradition method, have shown little inventiveness, but are nevertheless able to threaten Western civilization by use on a gigantic scale, almost entirely imported from Western civilization. A similar situation may develop in any new civilizations would come into existence on the fringes of Asia. Very key. This is what's going on right now. This is part of Quigley's dilemma from the last part. The most important parts of Western technology can be listed under 4 headings. The ability to kill, development of weapons, the ability to preserve life. This is what we've gone through. The development of sanitation and medical service. The ability to produce food and industrial goods, materialism, the improvement in transportation and communication, the shortage connecting the whole civilization. Here he talks about the diffusion of firearms and the impact it had on other societies when Spain invaded Mexico. The use of the bomb in 1945, and he's going over the importance of the diffused elements in how they changed and diffused into the rest of the world.